Hi, everyone. This is Father Doug Scharf.
I'm David Dixon.
And I'm Father Derek Larson. And welcome to Sunday Ready. This week we're preparing for Sunday, May 1st, 2022. And our readings are Acts chapter 9, verses 1 through 6, Psalm 30, Revelation chapter 5, verses 11 through 14. And the gospel for this week is John chapter 21, verses 1 through 19.
Great. All right, thank you. It's good to be back together. We had a couple weeks there in a row where Father Derek was on paternity leave. I had some other obligations, so it's good to have the gang back together. We did take last Sunday off, the second Sunday of Easter, to give us a break. We took a couple of days off from the office that week after Easter. But we're back. It's the month of May. We are continuing the season of Easter together. So just a word about the readings. You'll notice that through the season of Easter, we don't have a lesson from the Old Testament. In its place, we have a series of readings from the book of Acts. And that's intentional for the season of Easter because it gives us a glimpse into the early preaching, the early experience of the church post-resurrection as they began to engage in the work of mission and sharing the good news. So we hear a number of different stories from the book of Acts. The book of Revelation gives us a glimpse into these heavenly visions of God's presence and the risen Christ in his glory. And then the gospel readings are a series of resurrection appearances, at least these first few weeks. So we had last week from the Gospel of John, the appearance to the disciples on Easter night, and then to Thomas a week later. Now we get another post-resurrection appearance to Peter today in John 21. So just a little bit of context for the readings and why we have this particular arrangement of readings during this Easter season. So with that, let's jump into Acts chapter 9. This is the conversion experience for Saul, who will become known as Paul. So let's jump in. What are your thoughts on conversion of St. Paul?
Well, just one note that you mentioned, that we're reading a lot of resurrection appearances in this time of the year, and this is one of those, sort of, right? This is after Jesus was ascended into heaven, and yet Jesus, the resurrected Jesus, appears to Saul, who becomes Paul, on the road to Damascus, and speaks to him, "I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting." And so I think it's interesting to read Paul in the context of one of those whom the resurrected Jesus appeared to in Scripture. And there's another place, I don't remember where it is, maybe one of you do, but Paul writes in one of his letters, Jesus appeared to this person, and then this person, and then these people, and then last of all, me as well. And so even Paul himself kind of saw this experience as one of those collected experiences of Jesus, the resurrected Jesus, appearing to the apostles.
Yeah, that's in 1 Corinthians 15. And what I love about that passage is Paul says, "I am handing on to you what I received," right? So there's this tradition of the resurrection accounts and the proclamation of the resurrection that Paul not only was a recipient of in his own experience, but also as part of that kind of apostolic succession, right? This passing down of teaching from one community to another, one generation to another.
And it's interesting because Paul, was not a disciple of Jesus, right, and did not know Jesus during his lifetime walking around teaching in Galilee and Jerusalem. And yet he became an apostle and wrote most of the New Testament and was an evangelist throughout the world. And this experience that we're reading about today is sort of the crux of that conversion and bringing him in to being an apostle for the church.
Right.
Yeah, I love the first line. Saul still breathing threats and murder against the disciples of the Lord.
Yeah.
I mean, he becomes one of the chief voices, right, for the early church I don't know if he would measure up today, right? I don't know that he would be accepted in the ranks of apostleship with his background. And that, I think, in some ways should give us some kind of pause. I mean, if God can take someone like Saul, who may be the vilest of sinners, and turn their life so completely around that they become a voice that not only shook the world that he was standing in, but continues to help shape our world with the words that he has spoken. God can do anything, right? God can change anyone's life. No one is beyond the reach of God, the redemption of God, or the call of God. And I think, as you were saying, that this is certainly a post-resurrection appearance of Christ to Paul in his calling. I think that is part of the resurrection story, that God can take someone like Paul, and through the power of resurrection and the experience of resurrection, change their life so completely that they become, we hear today a lot about being a social media influencer. They become an influencer, right, with the world that they're living in at that time. I think it is powerful.
And it's part of a long tradition in scripture of God using really kind of messed up, broken people, right? That wouldn't pass the commission on ministry. And if you don't know what that is, that's sort of the the group that vets people who are seeking ordination or seeking discernment towards other areas of ministry, and they go through an intense process of psychiatric evaluation. Paul wouldn't have made it past the first gathering, the social, hey, what's your name? My name's Saul. Oh, we know about you, right? He would have been done. And yet Moses and David and Saul and so many other folks who really had a sordid past, God chooses to use. One thing I wanted to note, this is not in this reading, but we know that Saul eventually became referred to as Paul, but there's no kind of dramatic renaming moment like there is for Abraham and Jacob and Sarah and others, where God says, you shall no longer be called X, you're now this. It just, in Acts 13, several chapters later, it just says Saul, also known as Paul, and then it goes on. So we think of that as part of the transformation process, and maybe it was for Paul and those around him. But from this sort of perspective of the divine encounter, this is not a renaming story, right? This is a repentance story. It's a conversion story. It's an experience, an encounter story, all of which, he's heading in one direction, literally to Damascus, and this sets him on a completely different course in terms of his life and vocation.
And the idea that he is met by the resurrected Christ and becomes blinded by that experience. And he doesn't receive his sight until he goes to Ananias, right? Mm-hmm. And then he receives a sight again. Sometimes we have to be struck blind so we can start seeing. And I think that's part of that experience. You become blind to stuff so you can really see what matters. And what mattered here was the resurrected Christ. Interestingly, as he continues, receives a sight, he goes down to the stoning of Stephen. And after they stone Stephen, they take Stephen's garments and lay them at the feet of Saul, who is now becoming Paul. And he, in some way, picks up that mantle, right? He becomes the apostle to the Gentiles. He begins to preach and declare the resurrected Christ to the Gentile people. And so it's just a really amazing story when you read about Paul's life and his calling, his conversion. He ends up in prison, right?
Yeah.
What a story.
Let's move on to Psalm 30. There's several parts of this psalm that clearly have themes of resurrection and new life. Verse 3, you brought me up, O Lord, from the dead. You restored my life when I was going down to the grave. So it fits the Easter season. When I read it, after reading Acts chapter 9, I immediately thought of Saul. I will exalt you, O Lord, because you have lifted me up, right? So he falls to the ground in this encounter, and then there's this raising up again, right? And I mentioned this in the adult forum when we talked about practicing resurrection, that the Greek word for resurrection, yes, it is used to describe Jesus, but it's also used to describe a lot of other events in people's lives. I mean, Peter's mother-in-law getting up from a fever is the word for resurrection. The man who's been with an infirmity for 18 years, when he is lifted up and takes up his mat, it's the word for resurrection, right? And so I think of Saul becoming Paul. You have lifted me up, right? You have raised me up to this new reality, this new experience of life.
I read it the same way. Hearing Saul's story in this psalm, which of course they were written centuries apart from one another. They're not connected inherently, but as we read them in this pattern, in this way, you can definitely see that. So lifted up, but also restored me to health. If you continue to read the story, God restored Saul to health, to sight. And even verse 5, for his wrath endures but the twinkling of an eye. And I think about twinkling of an eye as in the bright light that comes and Saul can't see all of a sudden. But that was just a temporary thing to get his attention. And then after that, his favor lasts for a lifetime, right? In different ways. So I definitely saw that too. But I think this is a great psalm for the Easter season, for resurrection. I always am attracted to verse 10 in this. What profit is there in my blood if I go down to the pit? Will the dust praise you or declare your faithfulness? We talked about this line in our Psalms class that we had not too long ago, and how the psalmist seems to imply, the answer is no, the dust won't praise you. But of course, we know that, yes, even the dust will praise you. Even in that moment, there's one part where Jesus says the rocks will cry out, right? So I think this is a great psalm for this season.
Yeah.
I read through it. I agree with everything both of you have said, for sure. But I also see kind of the seasons of our life, that there are times when we go through seasons of weeping, but then we're going to experience joy. It's easy to focus on the bad stuff in life, the negative stuff in life, the hard stuff in life, and forget that there is a morning coming, right? There's going to be joy just as sure as there was sadness. There's going to be life just as sure as there was death. There's going to be a springtime just as sure as there was a winter. When everything becomes dry and barren, you will produce fruit again. So I feel like this rhythm of life when I read this psalm, that we go through these things. I love how this particular translation renders this. Weeping can spend the night. I don't want weeping spending the night with me, but weeping may spend the night, but joy comes. There's somebody else that you're going to wake up to. It's called joy, right? Comes with the morning. And that's such a, he turns my mourning into dancing. Things aren't going to stay the way they are. It will change and get better. And then you'll go through something else. It's just
I've never read it that way, Dave. I love that image of weeping, as a guest for the night or a visitor, right? And then, but joy is the one coming in the morning. Yeah. I like that. That's good. Well, we have a very dense gospel reading, so let's say just a few words about Revelation, and then see if we can spend the remainder of our time on John chapter 21. So the epistle reading, it's not really an epistle, but it's in that place in the series of readings from Revelation chapter 5. I personally love these descriptions of the throne room in heaven and the worship that is perpetually and eternally taking place in heaven. I just think they are so powerful and inspiring and literally lift me up when I read them. This one in particular, there's a couple in this kind of 5 through 7 kind of area in Revelation, but this one, they're singing the song to the Lamb, right, which is one of our canticles that we use in the morning prayer office. Anyway, other thoughts on this passage?
I'll just say that, Revelation is hard for all of us to understand, but just keep in mind that Revelation is the sci-fi fantasy of the Bible. It's supposed to have weird creatures and interesting things happen, imaginative things, and all of these imaginative things, some of them can tell, the future, if we think about it that way, but often they're telling the story of the resurrection as well, and they're telling the story of Jesus. So here, worthy is the lamb that was slaughtered, of course, is referring symbolically to Jesus. Jesus is worthy, is a lamb, and that was slaughtered. And this past Sunday, I preached on the wounded, resurrected Jesus. And here's another example of that the lamb that is worthy and is sitting on the throne that is being worshiped was the one that was slaughtered. So we see that even here. This is an imaginative kind of fantasy version of the story, but in some ways it's the same story, or a continuation of that.
Yeah, the only thing I would add to what you all have said, so we can move on to the gospel, is that the first verse in Revelation, and it is singular, Revelation. I hear a lot of people misquote just the title and say revelations. There's only one revelation. This book's only about one thing, and it is the revelation of Jesus Christ. So everything you read in Revelation should be understood in the view that it is revealing Christ. And that's what it's about. And as Christ is revealed, what happens in this passage? The entire created world begins to sing praise.
Yeah.
And I'll just add one more thing since I'll circle back, just, to respond to both of you. And Derek and I talked about this last week when we were talking about his sermon coming up, about, it not in this passage, but I think really close to this passage. Jesus is referred to the lion as the Lion of Judah, right? But then when they turn, they see the Lion of Judah, they turn and behold the Lamb that was slain, right? So this simultaneous image of power and authority and woundedness, and Jesus retains both of those. So I think that fits nicely with your sermon, and also this idea that this is about revealing the fullness of who Jesus is now in his resurrection glory and continuing as the Lamb who was slain. So, all right, John 21. This is a jam-packed gospel reading. I love John because we get these wonderful kind of very human stories of Jesus sharing meals and going fishing with them again, and dealing with these complex relationships like with Peter, and all of that is in this gospel. I haven't even started to look at what I'm going to preach on yet, but there's so much here. You can really only preach on one element because there's so much going on. But let's start with just the very beginning. Jesus showed himself again to the disciples by the Sea of Tiberias. That's the Sea of Galilee. It's all one body of water by different names. So we are now past where we were this past Sunday, right? So there was the Easter appearance, then 1 week later with Thomas, and now there's another appearance. And Peter says, "I'm going fishing," which I just love, right? What do you do when you don't know what to do? You go back to what you've done, right? And so Peter goes back fishing. I think that's just such a human response that we all do. I don't think he knows what to do with the resurrection and the fact that Jesus is back among them.
Yeah, it's like we're back where we started, folks, right? I mean, it all started by the sea, the lakeshore fishing, and we're right back at that place. I think it's instructive in a lot of ways. The initial call of the disciples on that day as Jesus is walking by the seashore and sees them, what does Christ say? He says, "Follow me and I will make you to become fishers of men." It's as if God's not requiring you to quit your job to serve him, but God will take you and your occupation to a higher level and allow the power of God to infiltrate everything that you do in life, whether it's your vocation that you currently have or something else. I think it's a fantastic view of, this is where it all started. We're coming back around here, and we're seeing Christ with the disciples yet again.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, I'm always struck by how different the Gospel of John is from the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And this is one of those examples. We're familiar with the story of Jesus telling them to cast the net on the other side. But in the Gospel of John, that doesn't happen at the beginning. That happens at the end. And so in some ways, we're looking at this and we hear it in the context of all the Gospels and say, like David, what you just said is what happened at the beginning is at the end. Peter's going back to what he did. And I'm trying to kind of go back and remember how John started, but in chapter 1 of John, Simon Peter, it doesn't really mention that he was a fisherman. It doesn't talk about the fact that he was in a boat. It doesn't do any of those things. And yet here we have a call story. It's a story that takes place after the resurrection. It's a story that takes place after the disciples have been following Jesus. And yet Jesus has this encounter with Peter and tells Peter to follow me. And it makes me wonder, what was the gospel writer of John doing when he decided to put this passage after the resurrection? It's almost as if he was saying that, yes, Jesus has been resurrected. Yes, Jesus is ascended into heaven, but that's not the end of the story. That it continues on, that Jesus continues on and his work continues on through his people. And so what does it mean to say, follow me, when Jesus is about to leave them? What does it mean for Jesus to say to Peter, follow me, when Peter had already followed him and Jesus is about to transition away so that he can't follow him physically? So I think it's an invitation to the reader and to Christians everywhere to follow Jesus in a different kind of way. This is not the kind of following where it was earlier and in the Synoptics, where they were literally following Jesus around Galilee. This is a spiritual kind of following, a deeper kind of following, where our whole lives are patterned after the work and ministry of Jesus. So I haven't fleshed all of that out, but I just find it interesting, the placement of this story in comparison to the other Gospels.
I think that's really helpful. And I also am reminded as you're talking, Derek, about the fact that our liturgical year is really based primarily on the Gospel of Luke, who, because Luke is a historian and wants to do things in an orderly fashion, as he tells us at the start, everything is very sequential.
Right.
This happens, then a certain period of time passes, and then something else happens. And so the death, the resurrection, the ascension, then the coming of the Spirit, those are all marked chronologically in Luke, and there's a sequence and a timeline that you can follow. Not so much in John, right? That the idea of death and resurrection and glorification and ascension, we were talking about this the other day, Derek, and even the giving of the Spirit. We heard last week, he breathed on them and the Spirit came on Easter night. Right. So in John, these all begin to sort of enfold onto one another. And what you just shared, Derek, really even adds to that this sense of calling and what it means to be a part of the mission of Jesus and be responsive to that call is also tied right into this resurrection, glorification, ascension, Pentecost moment that's all happening at the same time in John. And for me, that speaks to the image of new creation that is very clear in John. It is finished, Jesus said, which is both a statement about what has been and also what is to come, right? This new creation that is coming to be. And of course, the resurrection happens in a garden in John, hearkening back to Eden. So I don't know, there's just so much there that I think we can tap into in terms of the uniqueness of John's theological vision that we're given here.
For
Yeah, I
sure.
like the idea that the end is the beginning. And
Mhm.
that's what's going on with this, right? This is the beginning. And we're back where it all started. It's the end, but it's the beginning of something more powerful. The story of the fishing nets and the fishing encounter in Luke, I think it's chapter 5-ish. As they're fishing, Christ says, "We cast your net on the other side," and they did, and they caught such a load of fish, but it broke the nets. That's pre-resurrection. Now the same encounter or experience happens, and the net does not break. So there's something powerful that John is conveying about resurrection. What didn't work before resurrection is now working. The call is now being empowered by the life of Christ. It reminds me, and Derek, you might appreciate this, in the Deathly Hallows, the last film in the Harry Potter series, he has this saying, "I open at the close." Something powerful happens, and there's a resurrection, right, that happens in Harry Potter. Something powerful happens at what is to be the end, but it's really not the end. It's only the beginning.
Yeah.
And I think that's part of what we're seeing in John's writing here.
And I'm also noticing for the first time, based on your reflections, Derek, that in the synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, this sort of commissioning of Peter happens at a very different place. When who do you say that I am? That whole encounter, and then when Peter responds, "You are Peter upon this rock," and it's a very different context, a very different word of commissioning. Here it happens after the resurrection. It's a moment of reconciliation. It's a moment of restoration, but it also is a moment in which Jesus says, this is your future, Peter, right? If you're going to follow me, these are some of the things that you're going to have to go through. So it's a much different kind of commissioning in a very different place. And so that was helpful, Derek, to think about that, what's happening here.
And just a sentence, I think we need to wrap up.
Yeah.
Next week, we're celebrating Good Shepherd Sunday.
Yeah.
And here we're already getting glimpses of sheep and lambs. And I find it interesting. We celebrate Jesus as the Good Shepherd. But again, Jesus is passing something on here. And he's asking Peter to be a shepherd. He's asking the Christians to be a shepherd. So next week, we'll talk more about shepherds and Jesus being our shepherd. But I think it's helpful to prepare us for that, to think about the role of being the good shepherd. Evidently, according to this passage, is a shared role, right? Jesus is commissioning us and commissioning Peter specifically to also be shepherds.
Yeah. That's a great segue. All right. Thank you both. It's good to be back together. So we hope to see all of you this Sunday as we start the month of May, as we continue the season of Easter. And we hope that all that we have shared today will help you to be Sunday ready. See you then.